This is the Concealed Carry Podcast, Season 11, Episode 14. And welcome to the Concealed Carry Podcast, part of the concealedcarry.com network, brought to you by HK. Today is Thursday, April 24th, 2025, as of the recording of this episode. And I am your host, Riley Bowman. This evening, this podcast coming to you late. It's 9:40 p.m. Mountain Time. Uh, but this is the only time I can get the podcast done this week, and I am flying solo. We're going to do things a little bit differently this time. Hopefully, you don't get too bored or sick of me listening to just me for roughly the next hour. But I couldn't manage to get a guest lined up for the podcast this week, and Jacob is out of town traveling for the NRA show. So anyway, you got me for tonight, and I'm looking forward to getting into this episode, this topic with you, because we're going to be talking about misconceptions about red dots on pistols. This is going to be, I think, a fun one as I go through several. I think I've got actually 11 listed. I don't know if we'll get to all of them tonight, but I have 11 misconceptions. These are statements that I have literally heard or read online from people that are wrong, or at least in part, or in some cases completely wrong about red dots on pistols or pistol mounted optics. So we'll get into that momentarily. But first, our sponsors of tonight's podcast episode are Heckler and Koch, HK. HK-USA.com is the website that I would point you to. I have been a fan of HK pistols for some time now, for about as long as I've been into shooting. I've always thought HK pistols are awesome, or HK guns in general. I think the classic P7 pistols are really, really awesome. I don't own one. I hope to, maybe someday. They don't, manufacture them anymore, but maybe somebody will consider hooking me up with one, because I don't know that I can justify just buying one outright. But I just held up here a moment ago. Got to be careful because of YouTube rules. But this is the HK-CC9, which is my personal carry pistol, and it has a red dot on it, a Holosun. It's a 407K. That'll come in handy for our discussion in tonight's episode. The CC9 is a fantastic pistol. It's great for concealed carry. I have also carried concealed the HK VP9L as well as the VP9SK. We have a standard VP9 as well in the safe, and they are awesome guns. I'm a huge fan of HK pistols. I think you should be too. Just head on over to hk-usa.com to learn more. They just recently redesigned their website, and it looks fabulous. A lot of great information and things on the site there. But also check out your local dealer and pick up your next Heckler & Koch pistol today. Today's episode is also sponsored by the 2025 Guardian Conference. This is a fantastic opportunity for 3 days in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. This will be our 4th or 5th annual conference. I'm losing track. My goodness. This is 3 days of world-class, fabulous training that you have the opportunity to partake in. And there's classes specific to learning how to use effectively and efficiently red dots on pistols. And so I think you'll really enjoy, if you haven't already attended with us, or if you are coming back for another go at it. I'm excited about that. Would love to see you there. But first timers were welcome. Absolutely. It is a welcoming atmosphere. It is a lot of fun to join together with like-minded people and spend 3 days getting awesome training from seriously legit world-class instructors that you won't want to miss this. So to learn more, go to guardianconference.com and get signed up. We do believe that this year's event will likely sell out. And so you do not want to wait to get your ticket to that event. We chose Oklahoma because it's centrally located in the country. Hopefully, many of you, it's close enough for you to drive and reduce your travel costs potentially. But it's also pretty easy to fly in and out of Oklahoma. The TSA there is easy to deal with. The laws in Oklahoma are great. And hotels are really close to the range too. You can also camp on site as well. You can set up a tent or bring in an RV or camper trailer. So really, this is one of the easiest places we could find in the country to host a world-class event like this. So guardianconference.com. Hope to see you there. So let's get into our topic tonight. So this was inspired because of a comment I saw online, and this is nothing new. I've definitely encountered comments like these multiple times over the years, and but this one just it just got me. I was like, whoa, what? Like, and I even tried explaining it to the gentleman that made the comment. I commented back to him and said, that's not how this works. And it didn't seem to quite get through to him. But as I mentioned, before I get into what that first comment was that inspired all of this, let me first make a couple of, I guess, disclaimers or just points of clarification, some context, I guess, for tonight's episode. First, this is not an episode where we're going to discuss specifically the pros and cons about red dots on pistols. It's not all inclusive of the various benefits or downsides about the topic or about the concept of RDS guns. RDS meaning red dot sights. And I'll actually talk a little bit more about some of the different words and descriptions we have for these types of guns or equipment. But it's not intended to be all inclusive, talking about pros and cons. What this is to just talk about what people get wrong about red dots or optics on pistols. The other thing is to clarify, we a lot of times, just because it's become kind of the colloquial term, we use the phrase red dots or red dot pistol. Let's be real that this is just a term. If I say red dot pistol, then you can just know that I'm talking about an optic on a gun. They could be green dots. There's also gold or orange colored dots in some of these optics. Some other terms are RDS, which I mentioned a moment ago, red dot sight. But also pistol mounted optics would be another term, or PMO, and also optic equipped pistols would be another term. So just know that what we're talking about is one of these little gizmos that has usually an electronically projected dot or reticle of some kind in a window that you point at the target to aim and shoot. All right, that's what we're talking about tonight, and the misconceptions that people have about those. And then also these 11 things I'm going to talk about. If I get to them all, we'll see how it goes time wise. These are literally all phrases. Yes, literally. I've heard them said or I have read them myself that people have said at one time or another. And in some cases, I have actually copied and pasted the exact quote, the direct quote. So this is not just stuff I've made up. And so my hope is that through this episode tonight that will help clear up some of these misconceptions. And by the way, I hope at a future date and time to do a similar episode about misconceptions about iron sights on a pistol, because I think it goes both ways. And it's sort of become popularized, I think, in the modern world as more and more people are adopting optics on a pistol, that then there's kind of become this like little clique or crowd that likes to kind of diss on iron sights, like you're still using iron sights, like what's wrong with you, like get out of the night or out of the 1900s, come to the future or come to the present time, like just kind of dissing on iron sights. So I think a follow-up episode about misconceptions about iron sights on a pistol would be totally appropriate. It's been kind of something I've worked pretty hard over the last couple of years to explore both sighting systems. And that's what we're talking about. The sighting, like that's all it is methods whereby we can confirm where our gun is pointed relative to a target. That's all they are. Whether you're using irons or optic, they just help you know where the gun's pointed. But tonight we're focusing on misconceptions about red dots on pistols. So let's get into the first phrase that I mentioned in my introduction that just kind of got my goat. I was like, really? Like, it's hard for me to believe that someone out there would think this, but if this individual is thinking that, then there's probably others that are too. And one more disclaimer: I don't mean to do this episode to be judgmental towards anybody, because I know that we're all at different places along the path in our journeys to gun ownership, to concealed carry, to shooting, to self-defense, all those things. And at one time, I have thought things that were just completely, out in left field. And you learn as you go. And that's hopefully, the thing that we are all doing, which is continuing to learn and study and make ourselves better in some way. So please don't take any of this as meaning to be mean or judgmental towards anybody that has actually thought or said these things. And maybe some of you listening will be like, oh yeah, I totally, I agree with that. I've said that same thing. Um, this is not meant to be a judgment against you, but I probably will have some fun with it. All right, so bear with me. So the phrase that I heard recently was, it was in response to somebody using, shooting with an optic on a pistol, and they said, "Well, good luck drawing the pistol, turning on the optic, and then shooting the bad guy. Like by the time you get it turned on, you're dead," kind of thing. And I was like, okay, hold on. Okay, so you think that if I have an optic on my pistol that's driven electronically by a battery, that the idea is that I'm not carrying it with it turned on already? Because, and by the way, he responded and said, "Well, yeah, it would be dumb to just have it left on all the time. That's wasteful of your battery. You don't carry your flashlight around, or your weapon mounted light, with it on all the time." And I was like, well, yeah, we're not talking about flashlights here. We're talking about an optic that projects a pinpoint sized point of light onto a glass window. That's what reflects it back to your eye, so you can see where that dot is located, or that reticle is located. It's very small, and it doesn't use a lot of electricity, and they can last a long time. And so I was like, no, you carry it with the optic on all the time. And it wasn't quite clicking for the gentleman. I'm not trying to be mean to him. It's just, I understand, like, this was something totally new to him, and that is okay. But this is literally where, sorry, Jacob, when you watch or listen to this, because Jacob has a thing about the word literally. Now, I used it correctly earlier. He would probably say it was a necessary use of the word literally, but I wanted to make the point that I have literally heard these things said before. But this guy was thinking that if you're using an optic on a pistol, that you have it in your holster with it turned off, and that when you draw it, you got to hit a button to turn it on, and then you can aim and shoot. And that is just not how it works at all. So, and the technology, by the way, has gotten so good with these things. They've gotten to be so efficient with their use of electricity that in some cases, some of these optics are rated for over a year, and sometimes multiple years, depending on the brightness that you have it on at. And the other thing too is that these optics, many of them have kind of a shake wake or shake and wake feature, or shake awake, whatever. Different companies use different ways of describing that, because they kind of want to put their own spin or branded or trademarked term to it. But shake awake technology, where the optic is technically on, but when it's not been disturbed for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever, it'll turn off. And then there's sensors in there, which this should be nothing strange to us in today's modern world, because we're all familiar with using a mobile device. That these all have gyroscopes and things inside them, different accelerometers and sensors that can tell when something is being moved, and in many cases the direction it's being moved in. And so a simple accelerometer is installed in most of these modern optics now. So you pick it up, and that tells it to wake up and turn back on. So yes, a very small portion of its electricity is being used to kind of keep that shake awake in standby. But I mean, these things can last for years in standby mode. The Holosun 407K that I mentioned, and not to like, I am personally sponsored by Holosun as a competitive shooter and a defensive instructor, but or pistol instructor. But this podcast is not necessarily sponsored by Holosun. And I'm not necessarily trying to be like, hey, go buy Holosun. I mean, okay, go buy Holosun. That's there you go. There, I guess there's the one little pitch. But no, I just think they're great optics for the money. But the 407K, the shake awake feature works fantastic. And generally, I mean, I actually just recently, in this very optic right here, replaced the battery, and it had gone well over a year since it had been previously replaced. And that was my personal test. I just wanted to see how long it would last. And I kept it on its not quite brightest setting, but like 3 clicks down from brightest setting because it's that was how bright that was like the right setting to have it in to be able to see that dot in just about any lighting condition. It was a perfect setting if I had a light illuminating the target, or a perfect setting if I was outside in bright sunlight. I could see that dot. And so it was like, I don't know, 3 clicks, I think, or button presses down from max brightness setting. That's what I had it set on and left it on that for over a year, and the battery finally needed to be replaced. And I'm going to talk about what that looked like, what that meant when it was time to be replaced, like how I knew it was time, because that ties in with one of my other misconceptions. The point is, optics on all the time. And generally, I try to replace batteries, especially on this particular optic, and many of my other Holostons, about once every 6 months on a proactive schedule. Replacing them once every 6 months has worked perfectly for me. So that's all that you really got to do is you can say, hey, on January 1st and on July 1st, I'm going to swap batteries out. And yeah, okay, you could talk about that that costs money, but I go and buy these in bulk. You can buy a 12 pack, 24 pack, a 36 pack of whatever size battery. That's typically a 2032 or a 2016, which is what this one used. And I buy them in a bulk pack, and they cost, I don't know, $2 a piece or something like that, maybe a buck and a half. They're not very expensive, in my opinion. And to do that twice a year, not a major expense on my pistols. And I don't know, I've got several boxes lined up here. I probably got a dozen optics at the very least that go on pistols. I might have more. I don't know for sure. So, I've got another one right here. This is an older one I've used. This is a Romeo Zero, and it still works. In fact, it was sitting right here on. I bumped it, and I could see it turn on. That works great. And I've got this is more of a competition optic, a Seymour. What's the model? Oh, there, I just dropped it. So it's probably broken, right? We'll talk about that too. That's right, the RTS2. It's been a while since I've used this one. But it's a great little optic. And those ones are just sitting here on the desk, and they still work, still turn on. The batteries, I haven't touched those in a long time because they just sit, and when I pick them up, they turn on. Anyway, so that's the first major misconception: is you don't draw the gun, turn on the optic, and then aim and shoot. You leave it on all the time. And it's not a big deal because you just replace the battery, once every 6 months or however often is appropriate for your particular optic brand and model. But for most of them, it seems these days that about once every 6 months is pretty safe. Some you can do about once a year. A lot of the Trijicon RMR optics, those typically will go a year pretty easily on a single battery. And I've had other optics in the past I had to replace about once every 3 months. So you learn and you figure that out, and you figure out what schedule you need to be on, and just do the thing. And it's not that big of a deal. All right, next one. This is kind of similar, but the phrase is, I'm going to reach for my gun and find the battery dead. Okay. And kind of a related phrase that's similar to that I've heard is, I'm not comfortable with relying upon an electronic sight for a self-defense gun because the electronics or the battery are going to fail me, kind of thing. Okay. So that's the next misconception about red dots. And why is this a misconception? Because it's based in some truth that it is a valid concern that your optic, it's powered by a battery and the battery can go dead. All right. Yeah, that can happen. But let me express to you from experience now. I've been using optics on pistols for the better part of a decade now. I think I got my very first one in late 2016. So next year it'll be 10 years for me. And I started really actively shooting and using them a lot in 2017, and then I think in 2018 is when I first started really carrying a pistol with an optic on it. For me, it was a little bit of a progression because I needed to get familiar with them, then I needed to get comfortable with them, then I needed to become confident in them from a standpoint of, yeah, this is working, it's working well, I know how to use it, and it's reliable enough for me to now say, okay, it's going to go in my pants, in my waistband, and be on my carry gun, right? And so my point is, I'm speaking from, better part of a decade now of use, and I have fired tens of thousands. I would actually say probably about 150,000 to 200,000 rounds in 8 or 9 years through pistols with optics on them. Okay, so I've got a little bit of experience. There are certainly others out there that have more than me. I remember talking with Dave Spalding a number of years ago. It was he explained to me back in like I don't know, it was like early 2000s. I think he maybe it was even the late 90s that he started, experimenting with optics on a pistol. Uh, and actually the idea of an optic on a pistol has been around since like the late 70s, early 80s. Now they were big old honkers back then. They were huge. They were tubular sights typically. Aimpoint was one of the first that came out with something that actually worked that you could mount on a gun. They were pretty popular in the Bianchi Cup and Steel Challenge. They also started to become a little more popular in the mid 80s and in sports like USPSA, but especially in kind of the early 90s. In that time frame, you started to really see, like I remember Jerry Barnhart like the year, I think it was about 1990, 1991, that he won his first national championship with an optic on an open division pistol. And so they've been a thing for quite a while. And that's actually another misconception, that it's like this new thing. It's not really new. They have advanced a lot, especially in recent years, and the technology has gotten significantly better. And they are kind of new in that it's becoming really kind of an accepted thing now to have an optic on a pistol. But anyway, the phrase, I'm going to reach for my gun and find the battery dead. In my experience, what usually happens is, and this is talking about how a moment ago I explained how I keep my optics, especially on my carry guns, like a couple of clicks down from the max brightness setting. So it's bright enough to be used in pretty much any of the lighting conditions I expect to find myself in. Uh, what I and this is important. Okay, listen carefully. This is especially true if you actually check your equipment on a regular basis. And for me, that's daily. Every day when I go to take this gun and holster and stick it in my waistband, I do an equipment check. Number one, I check the holster, make sure the holster's good and still safe and functional. It's not cracked or anything like that. Okay. Number two, check the gun, make sure the gun's first loaded. Right. I'm carrying a gun for self defense. It better be loaded. Number three, check that the things like the sights are in their proper position, because sometimes you might notice that an iron sight will come loose and drift over to one side or another. So if you're paying it close attention, you'll notice things like that. And along with that, I'm checking the optic. Is the optic still on? Does it function like it's supposed to? Things like that. So recently, I told you I replaced this optic on my carry gun. And the reason why was because I did my daily check before I holstered up for the day and noticed that the dot, I was like, seems a little dim. It seems a little dim. And I was not sure about that. I was like, well, okay, maybe I bumped, maybe I turned it down and just forgot to turn it back up or something like that. And so I clicked the plus button to make it brighter, and it didn't get brighter. And in fact, as I clicked the button to increase the brightness, I would see that the dot actually would, as I pressed the button, the dot would, for just a brief second, split second, it would just dim. So in other words, as I'm pressing the button, it's using electricity to perform the action the button's supposed to do, and that's using enough electricity that the dot brightness was briefly dimming. And I'm like, yep, it is in fact dimmer than it's supposed to be because the battery is now needing to be replaced. So the battery didn't just die on me. The optic didn't just turn off. Like, I just noticed that it was dimmer than it should have been. And that's how I would answer this misconception, that you shouldn't just reach for your gun and find that the optic is dead. Now, the electronics can fail. That is true. However, these optics now, I mean, especially if you're using any from the mainstream brands, Trijicon, Aimpoint, Halcyon, I would say is pretty mainstream now. Leupold still has a pretty good reputation in this regard. Vortex still is very good as well, and they've released some optics recently that are really solid. The Shield RMS, RMSC optics, pretty, they've been around a long time. They work pretty well. They generally are pretty reliable. Have I encountered a few bad optics over the years, or that have just stopped working for whatever reason? Sure, I have. But for the most part, and then that's why you do an equipment check, right? Make sure, okay, it's working. And if it's not, well, then I'll grab a different gun, or I'll use my iron sights. That's why I have backup irons. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, but they are really reliable. the technology has really come a long ways. And I mean, even with thousands and thousands and thousands of rounds, I've got one optic. It's a Sig Sauer Romeo 1, an original Romeo 1, first gen, that had I didn't have an exact count, but I estimated was well over 40,000 rounds, and was still it actually until recently. Oh, it's right here. Here it is. Here is my original Sig Sauer Romeo 1 optic, and I do believe I actually removed the battery from this one, but it this has over 40,000 rounds on it and still functions. 40,000 times that it's gone through that recoil cycle. Bam, 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 bam. And it has just ran and ran and ran. So the optics are very reliable these days, and they're just going to continue to get better. All right. So generally speaking, you're not going to just wake up one day, grab your gun, or draw it out of your holster and just find it dead. If you're checking your equipment, you should realize, oh, this is not as bright as it's supposed to be, or something to that effect. You should notice. I know in another optic, it was not. It was actually way more obvious. I got up, I checked it, and it was a lot like this most recent one. It was just dim enough that I could I could just kind of tell. But there was another time I picked one up, and I was like, oh yeah, that's dim. Press the button to get it brighter. It wouldn't get brighter at all. Okay, replace the battery. It was still usable. And this one was still usable when I replaced the battery recently. I could have gotten the job done that day and probably for another several days, maybe for another week or two. It would have still functioned in that battery low state. But that was the sign that, hey, it's low. I can see it because it's dimmer than it's supposed to be and it won't get any brighter. It's time to replace the battery. And so you always keep some on hand. At least you should. All right. And if you don't, Amazon works pretty good and they get to you pretty quick. So that's that next misconception. And to the other quote about, I'm not comfortable relying upon an electronic sight for self-defense gun. I understand that there's kind of this, oh, it's electronic and that can fail. Yeah, guess what? That is true, but again, in my experience, they have proven to be very reliable, especially for many of these mainstream brands that I have personal experience with. And so I have no qualms whatsoever about carrying one of these. And you know what? If it quits working, I have backup iron sights. All right. The other thing is that actually I forgot what the other thought was. So we'll move on to the next one. Here we go. It's fun doing this on my own. I'm not trusting my life to a fragile optic. That's probably sounds a little bit similar to those other phrases, but this is referring to the fact that, hey, it could get dropped. It could, the window, the glass could break, it could get shattered, it could crack, that kind of thing. I wish I actually had it handy here. It's put away over here to my left. I'm not going to bother grabbing it, but I shot for 2 seasons with 2 Romeo 3 Max optics on my competition guns. One had a crack in the glass, one had a chip. One was because of a friend that dropped I had the gun disassembled and he just picked up the slide with the optic on it. He was looking through it, you're looking at it, and he accidentally dropped it on a granite countertop and cracked the glass in my optic. I shot the next day at USPSA Nationals with that cracked optic, and it worked fine. It didn't lose zero even. And then I continued to use that same one for a whole nother like 2 seasons beyond that before I finally retired it. And it's actually been sitting waiting to go back for repair for quite some time now. And the other one had a chip in it. Never bothered me. I didn't worry about it. I just kept using it and still used it up until just recently. And it's only because I switched over to competing with different guns. So not trusting my life to a fragile optic. Yes, you can damage them to where they become unusable. But here's the thing: if let's be real about context and the intended use for these things. Now, this is the Concealed Carry podcast, so most of what we are concerned with are civilian-based concealed carry contexts, which means that generally I am carrying the gun inside my waistband or underneath clothing of some kind. And that naturally helps protect the gun and optic from bumps and bangs and dings and things like that, because it's not in a duty holster that's exposed to the whole world like a law enforcement officer would be, right? Now, if you are in a law enforcement or security context or military context, then this is a different concern. You want a really strong, robust, like built like a tank optic. That's where like the acros and acro P2 and things like that, the RMRs. That's where those come into play, because those are really geared towards hard use and duty use. Contexts where people are carrying them outside the waistband, exposed to the world, where you might end up on the ground, you might bump into a door frame or whatever, and that could, subject that optic to potentially being broken. And so you want built like a tank optics for those contexts. In a concealed carry context, pretty much all my optics are open window, standard reflex sight. Reflex meaning that's that concept of it projecting a point of light and reflecting off that lens back to your eye, and it's exposed glass in typically an aluminum frame, although some are like titanium and things like that. Um, and that, I have cracked a couple over the years, and they still continued to work. But in a concealed carry context, I'm not that worried about this getting dropped or broken while I'm carrying it. Now, it could happen outside the holster in some way. But again, if that happens, uh, there are alternative means of using it. Either it still works with the cracked or damaged glass, or you can use non-traditional aiming methods, meaning like I could sight down the corner of the optic, I could sight down the corner of my slide, I could use the top edge of my optic, I could just frame the target, inside the window, or superimpose my gun and optic over top of the target. And this is assuming I can't use the backup irons. Okay, and if I can use the backup irons, then use those. And so I don't worry that much about these optics being quote unquote fragile. Now, there are some designs out there that have really thin, actually, this RTS2, the Seymour RTS2, it's got a fairly thin frame around that glass. All right. And the same is true with this Romeo 1 that I showed earlier. Okay. I broke one of these. Actually, I was taking my gun apart and it just fell out of my hand. I dropped it to the floor and it shattered the glass. I could have used the backup irons, and I sent it in, got it fixed, and it was not a big deal. But after that, I only used this with a steel shroud wrapping it, and that helped a lot, made it a lot more durable. Okay. But generally, so there are some designs I would probably avoid because they are just not that well built at all. But these Holostons have a pretty solid frame around them, and I have yet to break one in just normal day-to-day use, especially in a concealed carry context. So I would not worry about that much. Next up, in a self-defense shooting, you're not going to have enough time to line up and aim a shot. It's just point and shoot. Now, before I get to addressing that, I forgot to acknowledge I had a comment come in from a live viewer on Facebook. Mark says, invaluable lesson I live by, know your gun. I assume that was in reference to when I was talking about, hey, do a daily equipment check, make sure you're checking your gun, your ammo, your optic, your sights, whatever it is, making sure your holster, making sure things are in good condition, and knowing your equipment, what it should look like, how it functions, and making sure that it's good to go before you're carrying it that day. That's an important lesson for any concealed carrier, I believe, or anybody that carries a gun for a living or for personal defense. So thanks for the comment, Mark. And of course, those of you that are joining me live tonight, I appreciate you, and feel free to drop your comments and questions. All right, I will address them if I'm able to, as I get the time to do so. So back to that, in a self-defense shooting, you're not going to have enough time to line up and take it and aim a shot. It's just point and shoot. Well, this isn't just about the optic, in my opinion. Although this comment was made in response to, hey, you got to look through that window and find this dot and put that on the target. And that takes too much time. Number one, it shouldn't take that long at all. It should not take longer than iron sights at all. I'll explain why in a moment here. But the premise of this question is totally wrong. Just wrong. Because one, I don't believe in just pointing and shooting, even in a self-defense context. Okay. Because a related phrase I've heard used is, this is actually a direct quote. I remember copying and pasting this one from somebody wrote, taking the time to line up that red dot takes time you cannot spare in a defensive situation. So we only point and shoot in a defensive situation. No, I mean, you can do that, but that is not effective in my opinion, nor is it necessary. All right. Because it with practice, it shouldn't take that long to aim your gun. All right. And by the way, let's recognize that there are different ways of aiming your gun that changes based on context or use or situation or distance or size of target. Okay. What I mean by that is there's a time and place when I want to hold the gun super steady and see my perfectly still, or as still as I can make it, dot on my target and press the trigger for a clean shot. There's times when with iron sights where I want to get everything, perfectly equal height, equal light, with those front sight and rear sight lined up just perfect and centered on the target, and press the trigger carefully and send the shot. Those are going to be typically longer shots or more precise shots, right? Okay. There's a time and place for that. And there's a time and place where I'm at 3 yards, 5 yards, really close distance, right? And I'm just going to superimpose the gun over the center of the target and press the trigger, because the target is so close that the gun itself, the whole gun in my hand, is swallowed up inside the target. Okay, because it's so close. And some people will point to that and say, "Well, that's point shooting." Okay, well, we can get into the what's the word? Not the nuance, but the semantics of it. Okay, but to me, point shooting is literally where you just point a gun and you're just using sort of your kinesthetic alignment, if you will, or proprioception of, well, if I orient my fist at the target here, press the trigger, it should get a hit. That can be done too, but generally only at about arm's length distance to get good, reliable hits. Maybe a little bit further with practice, but it shouldn't even be necessary, because how hard is it really to get some amount of visual reference of gun and target? Okay, because the most basic kind of gross sight picture, I mean gross as opposed to, say, fine, so like fine motor skill, gross motor skill. I'm not talking about motor skills, but I'm using the word gross and fine to define, a fine sight picture is where I'm looking to get things perfectly centered up for a precise shot. And a gross sight picture is where I'm just using the grossest of information, which is take the outline of the optic, the window itself, or the gun itself, because people have been doing this a long time too, just with iron-sighted guns. And you just put the gun over top of the target because you're 3 or 5 yards, a relatively close distance, where the gun is just swallowed up within the body of the target, and you line it up just like that and send the shot. Okay. To me, that's not point shooting, because you're still using some amount of visual reference to the target, gun to target, to know that you're aiming the gun at the target. Okay. So that is not point shooting. And you can use that same technique with optic equipped pistol. All right. And in fact, I would say you should in some contexts. Those really close up close fast shots, all right? Where time is of the essence. Creating space is of the essence, being overwhelmingly just overwhelming your opponent with force because they're right there in your face trying to kill you. Okay, those kinds of contexts. All right, you should be using a gross sight picture. Now, as you start increasing distance, 7 yards, 10 yards, now you need to see something in your sights. Okay. With the iron sights, you just kind of see the front sight somewhere in the rear notch, maybe. All right. With the dot, you just see maybe a flash of red, or you see a dot just kind of in the window there. But, and like, you just don't need to see, you need to see something, but not, it doesn't have to be perfectly refined and perfectly centered up and holding perfectly still. Okay. So, that's where, in response to this, you don't have time and trying to line up that red dot takes time. You cannot spare in a defensive situation. I call bogus on like I just don't agree with that. And the concept of only pointing and shooting a gun is, I think, just wrong. All right, because it shows a lack of accountability in your shots, a lack of accountability in your hits, and I can point you to a number of body cam footage or officer involved shootings, and because those are the best examples we typically have, because we get to see the perspective of the officer a lot of times and see kind of what they're doing. And I can tell the officers that are just pointing in the direction of their threat and pressing the trigger because bullets are going all over the place. They are not aiming those shots. All right. And I can show you that it doesn't take as long as you think it takes to line up your sights or your dot and fire a shot. And it should not take longer to do it with a red dot than iron sights. And what is quicker? Okay. Getting hits on target because you aimed them, or eventually getting a hit after you've missed 5 times because you weren't aiming the gun. Guess what? Getting that first hit because you aimed it, and then the second one and the third one, and they're all going where you want them to because you aim, is way faster than missing a bunch of times and occasionally connecting. Okay. So that's the other point to this is like, oh man, like you want to aim those shots. All right. Now, why should it never take longer with a red dot than irons? This is assuming you're not losing the dot in the window or outside the window of the optic. That's a different thing, and that can be addressed separately. But the reason why is because a red dot eliminates one of the planes of alignment that we're concerned with. With iron sights, we have target, then we have front sight, and then we have rear sight. And then we technically have our eye, right? Our dominant eye that's looking through the sights at the target. There's really 4 things that all have to align for us to get a hit on target, okay, with iron sights. With a red dot, we eliminate one of those because at that point, we're just concerned with target and the dot. And of course, the eye has got to be in line with that, right? But we eliminate. We don't have front and rear sight that we are no longer concerned about where's front sight relative to rear sight, and then where is that relative to target. We just put dot on target, send shot. It's way simpler than using irons in that regard. Okay. Now you can still use irons really fast and be very effective, and people have been doing it a long time. Do you need a dot? No, you don't necessarily need a dot to be effective, but it is not complicated to just line up a dot on the target and send the shot because you're eliminating one entire plane of reference or plane of focus. Although I'm not necessarily concerned about focus. That's a topic for another day, probably. But anyway, aiming with a red dot is simpler and easier than aligning iron sights. It just is. All right, because you're getting rid of one entire factor in that. Okay, here's I think the 5th one. Every time I look through a red dot, the dot is distorted. Okay, this is a true, legit thing. Like, this is totally true. There's nothing wrong actually about this statement. But what's wrong about it is someone being concerned about it being distorted and somehow equating that to it's unusable. That is not true. All right. Now, what happens is now some of this has to do with the quality of the emitter on a red dot optic. Some of it has to do with the quality of the glass in the reflex window of the optic. But the big thing that impacts the clarity and crispness of a dot, it has to do with our own eyes, and the most common cause for a distorted dot is astigmatism. Now, I didn't even know I had astigmatism until I started using a pistol mounted optic. And the reason why is because I picked one up and I'm like, well, the dot is like it's not a circle. It's sort of like it looked like a comma. And then it had kind of like these little rays coming off it, kind of like a star, but it was a very ugly looking star. And so I'm like, what's up with that? In my next eye doctor appointment, I asked about about it, and because my eye doctor at the time happened to be a shooter, which was really cool, and he retired, unfortunately. I kind of miss having him as my eye doctor because I could talk to him about this stuff pretty easily, and it made sense to him. And he's like, "Oh, well, you have a little bit of astigmatism." And so I was like, "What?" I've had corrected vision pretty much my whole life, as long as I can remember, and I nobody ever told me I had astigmatism. He was like, "Well, the reason I never mentioned to you," he's like, "I don't know about your previous eye doctors," but he's like, "I didn't mention it because it was before he knew that I was a shooter, because that came up after I'd visited him a time or 2." And he's like, "I didn't know that you were a shooter, and I didn't know that was a factor, and because your amount of astigmatism is so slight that it was basically like," he's like, "there's no point in correcting it for you, all right? Except for in a few select conditions, and this would be potentially one of them, which is that, hey, if I wanted to see a crisper, cleaner, more circular dot, then we could correct for that little bit of astigmatism, and it would improve the look of the dot in my optics." And so we discussed that. And again, it was my astigmatism is so slight. It was like it's really a non-issue in normal day-to-day stuff. And so like that's not an issue. But it was like, how much is the juice worth is the juice worth the squeeze with respect to correcting for it for my optics? And so it just came down to dollars and cents. And he's like, "Well, currently your contacts that you wear don't correct for astigmatism. And those are the cheapest contacts you can get. To get astigmatism correcting contacts, they're 2 times, 3 times more expensive." Or more in some cases. And so, we looked at the price of that, and I was like, I don't feel like spending that kind of money on my contacts or glasses for that matter. I don't wear my glasses, regularly, except for like at night and stuff. But I was like, I don't feel like spending all this extra money on these. And so I just said, you know what? I will deal with the funky looking little, dot thing in my optics. And guess what? I shoot just fine with that. All right. So you learn to cope and compensate for that, and you move on with life. You put the bright red, shiny glowy thingy on the target and you press the trigger. Okay. And what I have found, by the way, is that typically the bigger the dot for me, and that's not necessarily going to be true for everybody, but typically, so like some are, at 1 MOA, those I don't really recommend for pistol use, but some people like them. 2 MOA, 2.5 MOA, 3 MOA, 5 MOA, 6 MOA. These are some common dot sizes. Okay. The bigger, the number, the bigger the dot. I have used 3 MOA and 2.5 MOA dots before, or 2 MOA. Yeah. I've used all those variations and they're fine. But the bigger the dot typically it tends to burst not as much for me, and it's not quite as deformed. And so the bigger the dot, it seems to work a little bit better for my eyes with astigmatism. So that's something you might look into. And that's one of the reasons why I like a bigger dot. So this particular optic is a 6 MOA dot, and I really, really like it. I like 6 MOA a lot. I've got quite a few optics with 6 MOA size dot. So what I would say to the phrase, every time I look through a red dot, the dot is distorted, is don't let it bother you so bad. All right. You can cite that in, by the way. Like, so one person told me that theirs kind of looked starbursty, but like the top of it had a little bit of a point. And I'm like, so cite it in for the top of the point of that star dot thing. Cite that portion in to be your precise aim point for whatever distance you want it at. And they're like, "Oh, yeah, that makes sense." And then when you're up close, you just put big glowy red thing on target and press trigger. It's not that big of a deal. So that, or get your astigmatism corrected. That, or just don't use a dot. But I think it's a poor excuse to not use an optic on a pistol, is because the dot, it doesn't look like a perfectly circular, clean dot. Don't worry about it so much. Next up, I need a lower third co-witness with my irons. This is one of my pet peeves where it comes to iron sights for backup purposes and the optic on a pistol. Um, it is a thing in carbine rifle world where you use a red dot optic on a carbine or a rifle, where if you have backup irons, there's really two schools of thought. One is where you perfectly co-witness, which is kind of dumb. All right. Because here's the thing. Think about this. All right. You invest in this optic on whether it's a rifle or a pistol, I don't care. Same, this still applies. You invest in this optic, which gives you this glorious window that you look through. And they're also pretty parallax free, to meaning where that dot can be just about anywhere in that window. Now you get to to the far edges, it can shift things a little bit, meaning that if you're sighted in for a particular target, particular distance, and you get to, and then you move that dot to where it's like on the edge of the glass, and it's starting, like on some optics that can really shift where that point of impact is going to be, because now that the edge of the glass is distorting that dot and kind of shifting it, it's bending the light, in other words, a different way. But generally you can be, anywhere within that window, and especially in pistol distances, 25 yards and in, I have not really found, putting the dot over on the left edge or the top edge or the right edge to make a real significant difference in point of impact. Unless I'm trying to shoot like X rings on a B8 target at 25, I don't really worry about. I don't try to keep that dot centered in the window. Let's just be clear about that. If I see dot, I send a shot. Okay. If that's the other thing, back to the point earlier about it taking too long to line up the dot, you do not have to use, this could have been another one of these misconceptions, so now we're addressing it. You do not have to put the dot in the center of the window to use it. That's one of the beautiful, glorious things about an optic on a pistol, is that the dot can be just about anywhere in that window. If it's in the window and it's centered on your target, send the shot. That's the beautiful thing. Okay. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility in that regard, because with irons, they're either lined up or they're not. Okay. But with an optic, the dot, it doesn't have to be perfectly centered in the window. That's a really cool thing about it. All right. And so back to what I was saying, you get this amazing contraption that allows you to not have to worry about this dot being perfectly in the center of anything. You just need to put the dot on the target. And then we cover it up with iron sights. What kind of sense does that make? Like you literally block part of your window with big metal things that you're no longer trying to use, supposedly. It defeats the purpose of the optic. So the two schools of thought for a long time, for decades now, is a perfect co-witness, meaning your backup iron sights on your rifle would be right in the center of your optic window, and then they're lined up with the dot. Well, that's dumb, because you're covering up most of your window and eliminating part of the benefit of having the optic. And so then guys are like, well, let's do a lower 1/3 co-witness, meaning that I'm generally looking up, above the iron sights. I'm using most of the window. I'm looking at the dot, but if I had to drop to my backup irons, they're kind of down in the lower third part of the window. Okay, that's a valid thing for the rifle and carbine optics. You don't need a lower third co-witness on your pistols. Now, you're welcome to do so, but these generally have a smaller window than what you have on your rifle optics. And so the more of that backup iron sight that you have covering up the window, the more you're taking the window away from you and the ability to use that optic to its max potential. And so I want co-witnessed, and that we could debate and talk about whether it's a actual true co-witness or not. Not going to get into that for purpose of tonight's episode, but I just want the rear sight and the front sight to be just barely visible above the base of the optic. That's all I need. And that's all it really needs to be there for. I want to, in other words, cover up, from my point of view, as little of the optic window as possible with my rear backup iron sight. So that's just, yeah, there you go. That's all I have to say about that. So don't be worried about having this lower third co-witness like you do on your carbine, since on your M1 carbine since 1985. That's not necessary in this context. Okay. Choose iron sights for backup purposes that are visible through the optic, but they don't need to be overly tall. All right. Number 7, red dots on pistols are just a fad. That would have been a more reasonable statement a decade or so ago, or even maybe 5-6 years ago, but they are not a fad today. I'm here to say that. Oh, sorry, I have some more comments here. Buckeye 2A. You lost weight. Yeah, I have. I appreciate that you noticed that. Dwayne, which optic is good for M&P Shield Plus? Dude, whichever optic you like and that fits that gun. The Optics Ready Shield Pluses come with the what we call the K footprint or the RMSC footprint. So that's this Holosun 407K. The 507K is the same footprint, same basic optic from Holosun. Um, it just has the multiple reticle option. I like the 407Ks just fine. I don't need multiple reticles. I just want the dot, and they're cheaper too, so that's a bonus. You can get the Holosun EPS carry. That's the enclosed version of this. You can get an RMSC. You can get the Romeo Zero. You can get the Romeo Zero Pro, I think it's called now, which is the upgraded version of the Romeo Zero. You can get the Vortex Defender CCW is an RMSC footprint. There's a bunch of them that are going to fit that Shield Plus. Choose which one you like the best, and they're all pretty good, if I'm being honest. Okay, the ones that I just mentioned. Not as keen on the RMSCs; they're acceptable, but I put them kind of on the bottom of the list I just provided. Can you explain how to look through a handgun red dot every time upon draw? It's hard to find the dot. That's a topic for another episode, Buckeye 2A. Sorry about that. Talking about misconceptions today. I just don't have the time to get into the actual use of the red dot. And we have addressed that a couple times on some different episodes, but we can get into that more specifically at a future date. In fact, I have something planned as part of a bigger project where we'll get into that. Excess big dot versus red dot. Well, I like red dot optics on my pistols. Yeah. And I've never been a big fan of the big dot, if I'm being honest, the XS big dots. I like the XS sights F8 night sights. I think those are fantastic sights. I've got those on a couple of guns, including as backup irons. But I'm not a big fan of the big dots. So I like to have a notch in the rear and not just this like low, or flat V looking thing. What about the holds though? What about the holds? Reliable Randy, you got more you want to offer there? What about the holds? What are we concerned about there? Eddie says, always great topics. Love it. Thank you, Eddie. Always appreciate your support. Rick says, glad I found this episode. I've been debating and getting one for my Ruger Max 9. Awesome. Hope this is helpful for you, Rick. And if you are just joining us now, you feel free to go back in the replay and watch the whole thing because we've talked about a bunch already. And we're already getting close to the hour mark, but I'm going to go a little bit longer because I got just a few more points to cover. Red dots on pistols are just a fad. I'm here to tell you they are not just a fad. All right. They are not going away. Why? Because when you see entire major handgun or pistol manufacturers make pretty much every one of their pistols come from the factory optics ready, like that, think about how much it takes to get major gun manufacturers to change everything about their manufacturing and put optic cuts on their guns. They didn't have to have cover plates made for the people that don't want to have optics. Like that's a huge endeavor for them to have to change what they're doing about production of their guns to accommodate red dots. The fact that all of the major manufacturers are making red dot ready pistols or optic ready pistols tells me it is not a fad. The second thing is the technology is going to keep getting better. And it's already really, really good. And adoption is already quite far and wide. Okay. Yeah, I know that a lot of newbies coming into the shooting world aren't necessarily coming in with optics, but very quickly, many of them are getting them. Once they get a little bit of time under their belt, once they take a couple of classes, things like that, once they try it, they're like, oh, wow, that's so much easier than lining up iron sights. I find teaching a new shooter, starting them on an optic equipped pistol is easier than starting them on iron sights. Why? Because I just put the red glowy dot thing on the target, and when it's good enough, you press the trigger. I no longer have to teach. I'm not saying I don't teach it, by the way. I'm not like there's still like we still teach how to line up iron sights, but that's just so much simpler to be like, put the red dot thing. And if they've ever played Call of Duty, then they know what it is. Hey, and in the game, you have the optic on your gun and you just put the red crosshair or the red dot on the target and press trigger, right? Like that computes for a lot of the modern folks that have played games like that. Okay, it's easier, it's simpler. And also, using a red dot on a pistol teaches you a lot about your own shooting, especially in dry fire, because you see every little movement that you make, and it helps you make corrections to that movement, so that you start becoming a more you have a steadier hold with your grip and your gun. Okay, and you learn like, oh wow, when I did that with the trigger, it moved everything a lot. You see that now, and it teaches you really quick how to make corrections to mistakes you're making with your grip and stuff like that. All right. Red dots are not just a fad. I am convinced of that through and through. They are not going away. And at one time, people said that optics, red dots in particular, on a rifle were a fad. Okay, we were having the same debate back in the 80s and 90s with optics on rifles, carbines, AR-15s, and the like. Now dang near everybody puts an optic of some kind on their rifles. Yeah, a few old school folks and retro type guys that have interest in that kind of thing will just run a iron sight AR or whatever. But no, you put optics on rifles these days, and nobody even bats an eye. It's not a fad, and that's just the direction the world is going. Number 8. Oh, another. Let's see here. Is the HKCC9 worth the buy, considering how hard they are to find? I'll tell you, they're going to get easier to find, okay? Because HK is still spinning up their U.S.-based plant. These are made in Georgia, in their production facility there. Uh, they are that is still coming online more and more and more. Okay, they are going to get easier to find. Christian, I think it's worth a buy. I think it's a fantastic pistol that is crazy reliable with a ton of testing history behind it. Meaning, like no other micro compact, I guess that's what we're calling these size guns these days. No other P365 sized gun has had 750,000 rounds in testing like the HKCC9 has had. So if you want a gun that you can trust your life with, you buy the CC9. That's what I think. And there's other good options out there. Okay. Somebody mentioned the Shield Plus earlier. That's a great gun too. But the CC9 is a great gun. And they are getting easier to find and will get easier to find. All right. So just to have a little bit of patience, and I think you'll find one that you can put the coin down on. Randy said, "You said as long as the dot's within the window, wouldn't you hold it up higher or lower depending on your zero?" You're not the dot. Okay, so if the dot's in the window, the dot can be high in the window, low in the window, left, right, whatever. But you're not holding the dot above your target. You're still going to put the dot on the center of your target, and we're talking pistol distances here. So you're not generally concerned about a holdover or a hold under with shooting. Let's just imagine we're shooting out to 25 yards, because most people aren't going to go beyond that with a pistol, right? Just put the dot on the target, and you don't care about where it is within the window. All right, that's not what you call a hold or a holdover or whatever like that. That's just that the window gives you the flexibility of having that dot, like it doesn't have to be centered in the very center of the window for it to be accurate, but you're still putting the dot on the target, the center of what you're trying to shoot. So I appreciate you clarifying, and hopefully that addresses your question, Reliable Randy on YouTube. I love some of you guys' names. Number 8, what will you do when the window gets blocked by dirt, mud, or lint? I added the lint part. Okay, I'm going to address that separately. What will we do about dirt, mud, snow, things like that? I don't worry about it in a concealed carry context, because my gun's underneath a shirt, a jacket, a hoodie. It's not getting dirt or mud in it. Okay. Now I could, fall to the ground or drop the gun, and it could get dirt or mud in there. Well, then I got to go to an alternative aiming method, which I mentioned a little bit earlier about sighting down the slide of the gun, the corner of the optic, the top of the optic, that sort of thing. That's something you could do if you got dirt or mud that block the optic window. This is also one reason why a lot of people are going to the enclosed window optics. That's where it's not just the front glass, but then the back of the optic is also enclosed with a back piece of glass. And in those cases, you can just wipe your thumb across it and wipe that crap right off. And that's one of the reasons why they like the enclosed optic. I am just not that concerned about it. I am in no way concerned about getting dirt or mud in my optic window in my personal concealed carry context. Lint, I added that because that sometimes comes up. So because I am not using an enclosed window optic, this does become a little bit of a lint trap. And some people be like, "Oh man, you got to clean it all the time." Yeah, okay, you can clean it all the time. Compressed air, by the way, works wonders. That's what I do 99 times out of 100. A little can of compressed air, or if you have an air compressor handy or whatever. Okay, we have an air compressor in the shop where we make our holsters, KSG Army holsters, and whenever just once a day in the shop, just blast out the window with the compressed air. If you have a can of compressed air, easy peasy. Do that once a day. Not a big deal. Doesn't take a lot of effort. And even then, sometimes I've gone several days, and yeah, it gets kind of a bunch of lint in there, or whatever. It's still usable. Now that's another thing. People will be like, well, "Yeah, but you can't see through it." Guess what? If you are shooting both eyes open, your non-dominant eye is going to be able to see the target information just fine. And crazy, I know, but even if you have lint inside the optic window, that that little pinpoint of light, the dot itself, is still visible unless you got like a crazy amount of lint, but that shouldn't really be the case. I'm just talking like day-to-day usage, um, you can go a week or two and you're still going to be able to yeah, the optic window could get a little bit obscured, but you'll still be able to see the dot. And you just superimpose that dot on the target that your non-dominant eye is clearly seeing, because it doesn't have the optic in between it and the target. Okay. So I promise you it works. You can still shoot with a crap ton of lint inside the optic window. You just put the red glowy dot thing on the center of the target and send the shot just like that. And then if you're concerned about dirt, mud, or lint, because the lint becomes less of an issue, and you can just wipe things off with your finger really easily. Just use an enclosed optic, and the EPS carry is a great option for that. For the smaller size optics, some folks like the Acro P2. That's usually what people are using on the bigger, more full size or mid size guns. The Hollow Sun. Uh, Drawing a blank all of a sudden. That's crazy. 509T. That's the enclosed optic that Holosun makes. Again, usually more for full size pistol, but just use an enclosed one if you're concerned about that. Not a big deal. Number 9, it's just added bulk. Okay, technically, putting an optic on a gun does add bulk. That's true. That's a true statement. Is it enough to be concerned about? I don't think so. Now, where a lot of people do kind of get hung up a little bit is they'll say, well, it hurts with concealment. And that can be true. Now, most of the time we have issues with concealing the grip of the pistol, because this is the biggest, largest thing that wants to project outward from the body. And so if that's the case, usually the optic is not the problem. Okay. Now, then those of you that are a little bit more discerning with your holster choice and holster design, a lot of folks, especially if you're carrying the appendix position, they'll have a wing or claw in the holster, and that'll tuck the grip back in. And sometimes if that's being really like almost too effective, it'll cause the optic itself to push forward a little bit, and that can be the part of the gun now that could print. This is just something that you have to figure out and dial in. So if you're having the optic itself print, then you either need to decrease the amount of wing or claw action that's being applied, or you need to increase the wedge on your holster so that it helps bring the upper portion of the gun back in towards your body. Okay, you can also play a little bit around with positioning of the gun on the waist and where exactly. Just sometimes little changes can make a big difference. Sliding a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, that kind of thing. Maybe tightening your belt a little bit more, that sort of thing. Just little changes can make big differences in how things conceal. But and if you're using something like a mailbox-sized Acro P2 optic on your gun, yeah, that's going to have a bigger chance of printing. Okay. Something like a 407K, though, is not very big. So I just don't worry that much about the bulk. The other related comment that sometimes is thrown out there is you're adding weight to the slide. Most of these optics weigh hardly anything at all, especially compared to the slide weight on this pistol on the CC9 is probably 9 ounces. I don't know. I haven't actually weighed it, but I'm guessing it's probably because it's most of the weight of the gun. It's probably a good 9 ounces. The optic that's on this is probably not even a half an ounce. It's just not enough to be that concerned with. So I'm going to move on from that point pretty quick. Number 10, irons are faster. If you feel like irons are faster, you probably just need to practice more with the red dot. And you probably need a little bit of guidance of how to use an optic on a pistol more effectively and more efficiently. Where people usually get hung up with irons being faster is they'll say they're faster, especially up close. What this means is the shooter that's trying to get a perfect dot sight picture in the optic and they're trying to center it in the window, they're taking so long to get that perfect sight picture with the red dot that is what's slowing them down, and they don't need that perfect sight picture. Okay. Do you go equal height, equal light with your iron sights on a 3-yard target? Probably not. And if you do, well, you're also being too slow with your irons. And so if you're looking for that perfect, still dot in your optic window, centered in the window, centered on the target at 3 and 5 yards, you are not using the proper amount of sight confirmation. You are looking for and waiting for far too much sight information before you're making the shot. Okay, because the same techniques we can use with the iron sights for being fast up close are the same techniques we can use with an optic equipped pistol, meaning that we don't necessarily look for a perfect centered up dot on target at 3 yards, 5 yards. I'm not necessarily waiting to see a dot. I am centering my target in the optic window, and I'm so close that the target swallows up that window. Like an A zone on a USPSA target at 5 yards is about like I'm seeing the whole A zone through the window of my optic. And if I have reasonably consistent grip technique, I don't need anything else more than that. Now, coincidentally, I usually do also see a flash of red or something in there that says, hey, there's a dot, but I'm not waiting for it. I'm centering up the target in that optic window on those close distances, and I'm sending the shot just like that. Okay. So if you're waiting to get a perfect sight picture with the dot, that's why you're being slow. And some people are also slow with irons. The fact is, a lot of people are way more willing to be loose and foot loose and fancy free with their iron sights up close than they are with a dot. And that can be taken too far to the other extreme as well. So we want to be seeing an appropriate amount of sight information for any given target and target distance, regardless if I'm using iron sights or an optic. And we can go deeper on that if we need to another time. The final phrase here, the transition to red dots is difficult. There, again, this is based in truth. It shouldn't be difficult though. The number one thing is that people have a hard time finding the dot in the optic window. And the reason why is because, and they'll say, I never had a problem with irons. Well, the reason for that is because they may have not have had good consistent grip technique in pointing, like they didn't point the gun consistently with irons in the first place. And they just didn't know it until they got an optic that didn't allow them to cheat. Now with irons, we can find the front sight and we're like, oh, well, there's the front, and I know it needs to be here in the notch of the rear sight, and so you can make that corrective action pretty easily with irons, even if it costs you a little bit of time. You don't get that reference with the dot as easily. So here's what I usually say, though, by the way, as you're learning this is a simple solution. There's more to it than this, as far as different drills and tips and tricks you can do to learn how to transition to, to having a consistent presentation. So you point the gun consistently the same way every time, so you don't have an issue looking for the dot. But if you ever point the gun at the target and you're like, "Where's my dot?" Your number one solving thing you should do, like to solve it, is find the front sight, because you should have a backup iron sight. Find that front sight just like you would with iron sighted gun, and put that front sight in the window. And you know what's remarkable about that is as soon as you put the front sight in the window, your dot's going to appear. Yeah, it's literally that simple. Put the front sight in the optic window, and oh, there's my dot. Okay, you can do that. It's not that hard. Now, learning the technique to point consistently, that there's a number of things that I would go into in that, and I don't have time to go into all that for the podcast. But number one, starting with a consistent grip right from the draw, from the holster, you got to get a consistent grip on the gun. If you don't get a consistent grip, then nothing else really matters, because then each time, if you grip it a little bit differently every time you grab your gun, then it's going to point a little bit differently every time you present out to the target. So we have to solve that first. So that's the first thing. If you're like, I'm not getting a consistent presentation, the dots, to the left, it's high, it's to the right now, then we need to look at your grip and make sure it's consistent every time. Okay. That's the start. That's the very first thing I would start with. The second thing is making sure that I eliminate extra movement, unnecessary movement, frenetic motion, as Scott Jelinski calls it. So unnecessary, extra, inefficient motion in my draw stroke and in my presentation to the target. So if I have extra motion going on, then what that does is it creates additional variables, so that by the time I get out to the target, it can be all over the place. And so we need to get down to the most basic, clean, efficient motion, shortest distance where possible from holster to target, and up to the eye line. And that's going to be kind of the next piece. The next thing is going to be making sure that I get my support hand on the gun early, and that together, both hands, dominant hand, support hand, move together in a north-south fashion. That means from me to target in a straight line. So I'm not going left and right, so east, west, all that, which, by the way, happens when our support hand slams onto the grip of the gun, which often happens because the support hand's getting on the gun late, and that sends your gun off to the other side, and that causes all kinds of problems. So we want to get the support hand on early, and then together, both hands move together with gun to the target in a straight line, bringing it to the target and up to my eye. And so we don't want to be dipping our head or eye down to the gun and the sights and the optic, because again, that's actually an example of extraneous or frenetic motion, extra motion that I don't need. I want to bring the gun up to the eye. That'll be a little bit straighter path, a little bit more efficient, and introducing less variables into the picture. Both hands move together, bringing it up to the eye and to the target. And that's going to be, those are three basic things that are make a big difference to you getting a more consistent presentation with the pistol. And that's going to help you begin to find the dot in the window more consistently. And again, if you get out there and you're like, I don't see a dot, then put the front sight in the window, and that's going to help you see the dot. Had one more comment here come in. Let's see here. My son had a 1-year-old checkup. His doctor asked me if I had guns in the house. Felt random to me. Had nothing to do with his checkup, and then began to preach about keeping guns in a safe and unloaded. Yeah, okay. So this isn't related to the topic tonight, but yeah, I hear you, brother. Christian. Christian's his name, by the way. And that is, I've heard examples of that, and that's weird and strange to me, because I agree, it has nothing to do with the checkup that you've just taken your child there for. So yeah, I don't. My standard response to that would be, I would just play dumb and not answer. Like, it's none of their business. I'd be like, that. What does it have to do with the checkup today? It's none of your business, kind of thing. So anyway, that, and I also tend to go to doctors that I believe are favorable to my Second Amendment rights where possible. So I've got a couple of great doctors for that, actually. Anyway, excellent stuff, guys. You've been wonderful. Great crowd checking in tonight. I didn't know what kind of response we'd have to the podcast on a late Thursday evening, especially the night where people were probably watching the NFL draft first round. But I kicked this off probably as that was ending, and so maybe I was able to capture a few of you tonight. As always, appreciate your support of the podcast. If you have any questions, comments, feedback, you want to reach out to us, you can do so by emailing us at podcast@concealedcarry.com. Jacob and I both receive those emails and review them and respond, whether we write back to you or we bring it up on a podcast. So thank you guys for your support. Today's episode, again, is sponsored by HK, Heckler & Koch, specifically the U.S. based division of HK, that's known as HK USA. Go to hk-usa.com to learn more about their products, and you can find them in just about any of your local dealers. So appreciate your support of our sponsors. HK has been marvelous to support us and support this podcast directly, in fact. And so we thank them for their support to make this possible. And your support of them helps encourage them to continue to support us. Also, today's episode sponsored by the 2025 Guardian Conference. I do hope that you will come and train with us for 3 days in Oklahoma in September later this year. It's the third weekend of September. Go to guardianconference.com to learn more and come take some great classes, including some red dot classes. Guys, thanks again so much. We appreciate you. And hopefully this solo podcast episode tonight was not too terrible to listen to. Until next time, a reminder to train right, train often, and train safe so you can fight hard, fight fast, and fight true. Take care.